Hi, Cookroot Recapped here. Today, I am going to explain an American sci-fi television show called For All Mankind. Spoilers ahead. Watch out and take care. The show is set in a parallel universe and it begins in the year 1969. Everyone around the world is taken aback by the first moon landing. However, it's actually the Soviets who have accomplished this. The people at NASA are in shock as they watch a Soviet cosmonaut become the first person to step foot on the moon. The next day, at a meeting, the chief of the astronaut office, Deke Slayton, reveals that Apollo 11, America's latest attempt to send a man to the moon, is scheduled to launch in 2 weeks. So, he orders astronauts Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin and Michael Collins to continue with their training as planned. However, the news of Soviets sending the first man on the moon has shaken the morale of the astronauts. They appear distraught, so Deke decides to let them take the weekend off. The astronauts appreciate this, and go to a bar, which is famous among NASA employees. There, a reporter approaches astronauts Ed Baldwin and his crewmate Gordo Stevens. It turns out the two were crew members of the Apollo 10 mission, whose aim was to travel close to the moon's surface and observe the landing conditions for Apollo 11. They are now set to go on the Apollo 15 mission. The reporter pesters Ed and Gordo about losing to the Soviets and makes snide remarks about them returning back to Earth without landing on the moon. This upsets a drunk Ed and he goes on a rant against NASA. He reveals that the space organization is scared of taking risks after the first Apollo mission tanked and resulted in an accident that killed all the crew members. The scene then cuts to the NASA HQ where the main administrator, Thomas Paine, astronaut office chief Deke, and director of Manned Spacecraft Center, Wernher von Braun, demand answers from a CIA agent as the American spy agency failed to warn NASA about the Soviet moon landing. In the CIA's defense, the agent replies that they reported 2 unmanned rocket launches, but they turned out to be manned. Desperate to get an American on the moon as soon as possible, Thomas asks if they could move up the launch of the Apollo 11, but von Braun rejects the idea. The next day, Ed's earlier comments about NASA goes viral. This obviously doesn't sit well with the superiors, so Deke reprimands him and reveals that von Braun has decided to remove him from the Apollo 15 mission. Instead, Ed will be assigned to a normal office job. The latter tries to protest the decision, but Deke doesn't hear any of it. Von Braun refuses to consider moving up the Apollo 11 launch when Thomas suggests it. Ed's prior remarks against NASA went viral the next day. This is plainly inappropriate. Deke reprimands him and tells that von Braun has opted not to get along with the superiors. Therefore, he was taken off the Apollo 15 mission. Ed will instead be placed in a typical desk job. The latter attempts to argue against the choice, but Deke doesn't pay attention. Von Braun refuses to consider moving up the Apollo 11 launch when Thomas suggests it. Ed's prior remarks against NASA went viral the next day. This is plainly inappropriate. Deke reprimands him and tells that von Braun has opted not to get along with the superiors. Therefore, he was taken off the Apollo 15 mission. Ed will instead be placed in a typical voice, but Deke doesn't pay attention. While Buzz moves closer to the moon's surface, Michael stays in lunar orbit. Karen, Ed's wife, is at Deke's wife's watch party while Ed observes the mission from the bar. Marge. When the two begin conversing, Marge says that Deke could reinstate Ed in the Apollo 15 goal if he officially admits that the reporter misquoted him. Though Karen states that her spouse values duty, honor, and the truth much and would never consent to it. In another area, Neil and Buzz approach the moon's surface slowly and are ready to land. However, they are having trouble locating a nice position as they draw near. The two get terrified by this. They are having trouble locating a nice position as they draw near. The two get terrified by this. As a result, they are compelled to land quickly. As a result, the mission Control loses contact with Apollo 11 via telemetry and all other channels of communication. After waiting for several hours without hearing from Apollo 11, von Braun comes to the conclusion that it is probable that a spaceship has crashed. Even Michael, who is in orbit, is questioned to come back down to Earth. But right then, Neil sends a communication to Mission Control, who informs them that Apollo 11 has arrived safely on the Moon. This informs every NASA employee into an ecstatic mood. While Neil hoists the Stars and Stripes, they begin to rejoice. They are having trouble locating a nice position as they draw near. The two get terrified by this. As a result, they are compelled to land quickly. As a result, the Mission Control loses contact with Apollo 11 via telemetry and all other channels of communication. After waiting for several hours without hearing from Apollo 11, von Braun comes to the conclusion that it is probable that a spaceship has crashed. Even Michael, who is in orbit, is questioned to come back down to Earth. But right then, Neil sends a communication to Mission Control, who informs them that Apollo 11 has arrived safely on the Moon. This informs every NASA employee into an ecstatic mood. While Neil hoists the Stars and Stripes, they begin to rejoice. Reaches the Moon as the first American. Neil and Buzz eventually complete their objective. And meet up with Michael in orbit on the Moon. The three of them then began their journey toward Earth. After 2 months, Ed has had enough of working behind a desk. One time, he approaches Deke and requests that he be added back to the Apollo 15 crew. However, the employer is still adamant about not returning him. NASA administrator later. The other senior officials are gathered for a meeting by Thomas Paine, who claims to have some awful news. He believes that the Soviets want to build a lunar outpost there. Thomas is adamant despite having already lost to them in a race. He gives von Braun a go-ahead to rapidly assume over and construct before the Soviets, the first military installation on the Moon. Thomas further states that the President, Richard Nixon, himself, gave the order. Von Braun created the V-2 while working in Germany. It has been disclosed in the meantime. Rockets. The Germans employed these missiles during World War II, which resulted in the thousands upon thousands of innocent lives. Von Braun thus rejects the directions from the President, who declared that he didn't want to make space exploration into another battleground. Later, he speaks with his student, NASA engineer Mario Madison. It appears that she has a job interview for a position at Mission Control with Flight Director Gene. Unfortunately, Margot exits the office in annoyance since the interview does not turn out as she had hoped. She is convinced that she won't be chosen. Yet the next day, as she walks into her office, von Braun proudly declares that she is the first woman to at Mission Control at any time. Margot is thrilled when she hears this and gives him a bear hug. In the following scene, Thomas Paine, the administrator, and a congressman. The latter offers Ed the opportunity to rejoin the Apollo 15 program, but only if he does anything for them. Von Braun will need to be defeated by Ed via deception. Giving a statement before the committee that is looking at NASA's mistakes, Ed is uneasy, considering the offer because, despite their differences, he respects von Braun. Simply asking him to consider it, the congressman reveals that even the president supports it. A few weeks later, Ed is spotted in Washington, D.C., during a congressional hearing. Surprisingly, he accepts responsibility for the Apollo 10 mission, much to the chagrin of von Braun. The congressman's shocked later, he decides to rejoin the Navy after leaving NASA. However, by bringing up his work, the hearing committee manages to corner von Braun. Connection to Nazi Germany. Von Braun regrets the abuse of his technology deeply. He asserts that his work for the Third Reich has no bearing on his work for NASA. The congressman exhibits several photographs and concrete evidence that von Braun also participated in the Nazi secret police known as the SS was notorious for its cruelty toward Jews. This demonstrates how the icing on the cake for von Braun, who is finally let go from his position at NASA. The Apollo 12 mission's launch is then shown in a scene cut. To search for a suitable location for the lunar base while exploring the moon. On that day, Deke rewards Ed with some encouraging news. After von Braun's tenure was over, he will be reassigned to the Apollo 15 mission by the new director. Ed is elated by the news. Given that helping his nation has always been his desire. As the two chat further. When Karen shows there, she requests that they watch the news. Unexpectedly, the story states that another spacecraft from the Soviet Union, this one carrying a female Russian cosmonaut, was dispatched to the moon. Has successfully set foot on the moon, becoming the first female astronaut to do so. The success has incensed the Americans, and as pressure mounts on them, they both established a lunar base before the Soviets as their ultimate objective. Therefore, Gene and Deke determined that Apollo missions 13 through 15 should be used to assess possible locations for lunar bases. Thomas Paine, the NASA administrator, enters shortly after. The two that the president now wants a woman on the moon and enters the room. Since there are no female astronauts, this is a dilemma for NASA. However, Thomas offers the names of two possible contenders, Patty Doyle and Molly Cobb. They were both members of the now-defunct Mercury 13. Earlier than it was discontinued in the early 1960s, the project's goal was to send women into space. Deke considers both ladies, and other possible suitors are introduced to him. Includes NASA engineer Danielle Poole. Thomas later informs Deke that the president has proposed sending Gordo Stevens and his wife Tracy, a pilot, to space. Deke is hesitant to accept the proposal, but Thomas coerces him. Later, Deke informs the couple about the proposal while at Gordo's house. To his shock, they adore the concept and readily embrace it. Gordo seemed particularly eager, and after Tracy becomes suspicious, it is discovered that Deke had promised him a certain payment. If he could persuade his wife to go through astronaut training, he would be given a spot on the Apollo 15 mission. After that, we are transported to 1970. Tracy and 19 other women aspirants arrive at their astronaut training session. Deke welcomes everyone and recalls the ladies that they would go through an extremely demanding training. They will all receive grades, and those who do well will move on to the program's next phase. The class begins, and Tracy has trouble keeping up with the other students, in particular candidates. She consistently comes in last place since there are just 10 contestants left. Tracy begins to think about leaving the program as well. And Gordo and her get into a furious disagreement over this. He makes